I could spend the next hour just listing the 50 or so novels, histories, memoirs, plays, and children's books that Tom Keneally has written over the past half-century, since his first short story appeared in Australia's Bulletin magazine, and his debut novel, The Place at Whitton, was published the following year in 1964. It would certainly take an hour if I were to include the mind-boggling range of subjects that those works have included. From a brutalised Aboriginal bushranger in 1972's Booker-nominated The Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith, to his account of ambiguous rescuer of Jews Oskar Schindler in the Booker-winning Schindler's Ark 10 years later, with also novels about Joan of Arc, the American Civil War, Eritrea's violent struggle for independence, a Palestinian plane hijacking, the Russian Revolution, and both World War I and World War II. And believe me, this is just scratching the surface. He has written biographies of Abraham Lincoln and notorious American Civil War General Dan Sickles. And later this year, he publishes the third volume of his mammoth history of Australia. And again, that's just scratching the surface. His latest book is the novel Shame and the Captives, about the prisoners and those guarding them in a fictional recreation of the 1944 breakout from the Cowra POW camp in rural New South Wales, during which 1,000 Japanese attempted to escape or be shot rather than endure the ignominy of having allowed themselves to be captured. It's his latest book, but not his latest work, because I see on his Twitter feed that he's just had a musical play open off Broadway in New York. And yes, you heard right, he finds time to tweet too. Just imagine how many more books there might be if he didn't have that to distract him. He also walks 6 kilometers every day. We're all sloths by comparison. But I'll stop because the clock's ticking, and I, like you, want to hear from the man himself. So please, ladies and gentlemen, welcome Tom Keneally.
Thank you. Thanks.
Now, Tom, I'm going to begin by being, I suspect, the first person ever to compare you to Bruce Springsteen.
Yes, you're on safe ground there, you are.
Bruce Springsteen, I recently heard an interview with him, and he talked about turning 60 and how it focused him very much as an artist. He realized that unlike when he was 30 and he thought he had the world ahead of him forever, he realized that he was going to have to be quick to do all the things that he wanted to do. Has there been some of that effect with you in later years, do you think?
Yes, there are so many novels, potential novels, that I'll never get to write, that at the Australian Society of Authors last year, I made a list of novels, the really great novels, that I'll never write, and passed them on to the members of the ASA to finish as homework.
Did anybody take you up?
I hope that the funny thing about novels is that novelists on different sides of the world are often struck by the same idea, and almost like an infection that hits two people simultaneously. I hope that some of these ideas people were already interested in, but one of them that fascinates me, and it relates to the history, is that Australia, perhaps more than New Zealand, has always been, and I'm not saying this in a palm-bashing, Antipodean persecuted way. I think we've quite rightly got beyond that. But the sending of undesirables to Australia didn't end with convicts. It continued with the unsatisfactory sons of the nobility and the economically unsatisfactory children of English slums. I was fascinated by the fact that Charles Dickens had a very unrealistic view. Great novelist, boy, if I could. But he didn't realize the problems of Australian rainfall, and he sent two of his sons Edward Bulwer Lytton Dickens and Alfred Dorsey Tennyson Dickens to New South Wales, and at the same time, because they weren't good at algebra or the classics, and at the same time, Anthony Trollope sent his son Fred. Now, these three young men trying to make a go of it pastorally in country that was beyond the country where Magwitch in Great Expectations made his fortunes. That would make a great novel. There was a time when all three of them were members of the Wilcannia Cricket Club. And not only would they stand round in sweltering summer weather talking about their fathers, their famous fathers, but on top of that, every second stockman and townsperson would come up and say, "Hey, are you blokes really the children of Chicka Dickens?" So that's a novel I'd love, just one example of a novel I'd love to write.
The range of subjects in the novels and the other books that you've written about would suggest a certain degree of fearlessness on your part in terms of the worlds that you're prepared to enter into as a writer. Is that true? Are you a fearless writer when you pick a topic and get into it?
I think reckless is more. With this novel, I wanted to write about something that happened in my childhood, this novel about the Japanese outbreak, and there were similar incidents in New Zealand, but I couldn't go into those because of the economies of the novel. And for a previous novel about World War I nurses, I hope it's a feminist novel. I tried to make it a feminist novel. But I did steal a New Zealand incident for that. And I hope there's a New Zealand high priest in the audience who'll give me absolution. But I warned you that I would forget the original question, and I have.
We were talking about your fearlessness.
Oh, yes, well, the fearlessness was trying to understand how there were young men who felt so ashamed of what had befallen of them that the only solution was to vote regretfully or in some cases alacritously for self-obliteration. 1,000 young men voted to charge the wire on a cold night in Cowra, west of Sydney, in 1944. We, of course, thought they were after us, but they were trying to validate the funeral services that had already been held for them in Japan. And I realized that I would need expert help not to make cultural faux pas. On the one hand, I didn't want to depict the Japanese in the propaganda way we thought of them then. On the other, I wanted to get the culture right. And so I got a great deal of help from an historian of Japanese culture at Sydney University. But I embarked on the book without thinking that that would be a problem. And that's an example of recklessness.
And when you're writing a novel about, say, the independence movement in Eritrea, is there ever a point when you're in the midst of it and you think, how the hell did I get here? What am I doing here?
Yes, I did. I did often think during the periods I was there, what am I doing here? But we had a special relationship with Eritrea. We had a very active leader of the Eritrean Relief Association in Australia, and he contacted a number of Australian citizens and asked them to go to Eritrea, particularly journalists. And I first went to write for the New York Colour magazine. Eritrea was a country that fought for 30 years for its independence. It had a great rebel leader called Isaias Afwerki, who since has turned, even when I first met him, I thought, are you George Washington or are you Robespierre? And sadly, he's turned into Robespierre. And you might remember, and it was a war in which families were wiped out more or less. Eritrean families remind me a bit of Holocaust families, in that, you know, if you meet Holocaust survivors, they'll tell you that nearly their entire clan is gone, and the same with Eritreans. And a few months ago, there was a ship full of Eritreans sunk near Lampedusa Island in Italy. So it's reached the point in Eritrea where the Eritreans are fleeing. But it all looked more hopeful then. It was a society that could produce its own antibiotics while fighting a war which badly needed mediation, but in which people would not mediate because it was a proxy war between Russia and the United States. And I felt I belonged there for this reason, that Australians and New Zealanders my age were brought up with the idea that we were, to an extent, the detritus. You were a better class of detritus, but we were the trailer trash of European culture down here in the case of Australia in the southwest Pacific. And looking at the world from that point of view, we felt isolated, and nonetheless, I felt I had a connection with a broader world, both through my father, who was with the Australian forces in North Africa. So I realized now I was only 1 degree of separation from the Third Reich, because he used to send me cake tins full of Nazi memorabilia. I didn't think this is a tragedy, they come from dead young men. I thought, this is cool. This is, well, we didn't have that terminology then, but the 1941-42 equivalent of this is cool. And so I never felt that we were far from the mysteries of our well springs. I had Irish grandparents who brought me up with an inaccurate idea of Irish history, but a passionately inaccurate one. And so I felt close to that. I felt close to Europe through my father. And then I was a member of the Holy Catholic Apostolic Church, which was a universal church, so that from Invercargill to northern Germany, the same Latin was used, the rituals were the same. So I think I never quite bought that we were separate from the world, and this set me up to be a bit adventurous and a sort of callow citizen of the world.
You're a strong advocate for or strong opponent for the way in which Australian detention centres treat asylum seekers. You would feel, presumably, that not enough of your countrymen share that outlook, or at least not enough of them in power do so.
Well, we have this system of mandatory detention, which are de facto, I hate to use the word concentration camp because it's like stealing it from the Holocaust, but they are de facto prisons where people who've exercised the right to seek asylum, which we recognize under the Convention on the Status of Refugees, are locked away for years. I knew a Côte d'Ivoire journalist who was locked away for 5 years. and all medical advice is that this is bad for human beings. And it involves children. So we have a system where not only do we lock people up, preferably offshore, but also onshore, but we call them bad names. I know refugees, asylum seekers have to be processed, but do they have to be called illegals? Do they have to be called queue jumpers? Can't they be processed? I mean, it's a universal problem, and it's a bigger problem for Australia than it is for New Zealand. But if this is the only way we can resolve it, then morality is doomed in this issue.
Is there an extent to which Shame and the Captives, reading it at the back of my mind in a way was the detention centres? Were they, I mean, with its kind of accounts of cultural miscomprehension and people coming together against that, was that ever in the back of your mind when you were writing it?
Yes, I got a thing about prisoners. I don't know what it is. It might, I don't know whether it was my great uncle who got 10 years for sedition and was on the last convict ship, and I don't know if it's my wife's convict ancestors or the fact that I was locked away in a seminary for quite a time, or I don't know what it is with me and prisoners, but I write a lot about them. And yes, prisoners go through the same derangement of the world in all prisons. You know, the world becomes a different kind of place, and acts of mass hysteria, such as happened in Cowra, are more credible. We had a lot of Italian prisoners too, and if they weren't black shirts, we let them out into the community. So in Shame and the Captives, the story of the Japanese compulsion to self-obliteration is told through the lens of an encounter between an Australian farm woman and an Italian prisoner. Now, I remember those days. You probably had Italian prisoners here because you had Japanese prisoners. And I remember those days when the Italians were let out into the onto the farms, and it was confidently said, generally by males, no decent Australian woman will look twice at an Italian POW. Well, the problem was that some of them looked like the young Robert De Niro and Leonardo DiCaprio. So there was a little bit of twice looking. And it's against through the relationship, because at that stage of history, we hadn't had the great post-war immigration, of which I'm very proud. As much as I criticize the present immigration policy, I'm very proud that of the way the post-war immigration worked, and the fact that between 1947, we brought in immigrants by the hundreds of thousands, but we also brought in displaced persons, that is refugees. And there were nearly as many, there were the same number of displaced persons in Europe as there are now refugees registered with the UN High Commissioner. And that was resolved by an international effort. And to get back to the present problem, I think there's going to have to be not denial, not preventive measures, because there are more of them coming from those catastrophic camps in Jordan and so on, the Syrian refugees. Maybe there'll be more from Afghanistan. But that problem post-war was resolved by universal endeavor. That's when we began to become truly multi-stranded. But during the war, Italians were still a strange people. And Giancarlo Molosano, the Italian in my book, is stranger because he claims to be an anarchist. And this is a philosophy that the young woman on the Australian farm, who's no dummy, but she's never heard of anarchism. It makes this Italian more exotic to her. But the Italian knows the Japanese, so that when the breakout occurs, there is a kind of tragic mediation involving him between her and the Japanese who turn up on her farm.
Your next novel is, in a way, going to be your first novel, because I believe The Place at Witton is being reissued this year to mark its 50th anniversary.
Yes, the first novel.
And it's not been reissued, I don't think, previously. You've not really been very keen on that happening.
No.
What do you remember of that young man who wrote that book?
Well, I, through no fault of anyone else's, I came from the Irish Catholic tradition, which is a very picturesque tradition. I mean, it makes for good stories, post factum. Actually living through it isn't as much fun as it is afterwards, when you can tell the stories. So I was in the last big pre-Vatican II generation of seminarians, and I left close to ordination, and I knew if I was ordained, I'd be destroyed, that I would become a bad priest, not in the sense, thank God, of child molestation. I didn't think such things were, I didn't know such things existed. And I didn't see any of it in there. But I can understand where it comes from, because the training was so totalitarian, and so it encouraged, in your fear of heterosexuality, the chance of not developing to emotional maturity existed. And of course, it is a mark of those priests that minority of priests who have been protected by the majority institution and who committed these crimes. And so by the time I left, I was a fairly lost character. I felt I'd let my parish down. I felt I'd let my parents down. I fortunately was able to teach high school, and I was studying law, always been a lawyer manqué, you know. That's why I got involved in constitutional law and the argument about the monarchy in Australia and but I was on the Constitution Commission for a long time. So a lawyer manqué, but pretty much a lost soul. And if you go, good-looking Australian women were just starting to go to bars then. It was the beginning of a golden era, and if you go in and they say, what are you doing? And they say, I'm a high school teacher. There's a tendency for them to say, next. And if you say, I'm a ruined priest, that appeals only to a certain narrow spectrum of psychotic. And to be able to say in Australia in 1963 or 64 that you were a novelist was like being able to say it here. I don't know if your sense of cultural inferiority was ever as profound as ours, but generally we thought whatever Australians are for, they're not for writing novels. To be a novelist then, the Australian Society of Authors was just being founded. There were no festivals you could go to to find out that you can't make a living as a writer. So I just set to. I knew that this was what I wanted to do, and I also realized that now that book wouldn't be published. In those days, they were far more sporting. English publishing was run by dozy old gents who won the Croix de Guerre for parachuting into the Balkans, the Legion of Honor for parachuting into the Balkans in World War II, and was sort of taking it easy and would come in at 10 o'clock, go to lunch at their club with an author, and by 4:30 they were on the train back to the counties. And it was not as hard-nosed a business as it is now. And manuscripts didn't have to be perfect. Financial people and marketing people didn't have a particular say, except in deciding at what degree of poverty you were going to live for the rest of your life. And so it was definitely redemption. It was a form of deliverance. I thought of it as a bit of flotsam that I could grab to, and it would take me to exotic places like the Embassy Theatre in Wellington. And that was it did. I'm ambiguous about it because it's such an imperfect novel, but also I know it saved me from becoming what so many ruined priests become, alcoholics, homeless, psychiatric patients, and so on. Well, some of them, they either become that or they become judges and overachievers. And some of them actually become great philanderers, but they're better looking seminarians than I was.
Do you retain anything from the seminary, did you think, in terms of, as a writer or even as a man?
Well, this grim battle between good and evil that goes on in my books, I think is very theological. And, when I was with my daughter in Donegal once, and I saw a mass stone at which a hunted priest in penal times in Ireland said mass for the totally economically disadvantaged, people who had no land justice at all, and who were standing around barefooted in winter, and a lookout on either hill to see if the authorities were coming. And I saw this mass stone, I thought, this is what it was about. This is why my forebears were so faithful to the church. Because persecution is wonderful for religion. Just look at Poland. When the persecution goes out of religion, half of its glamour does. And, I think that's the truth. When you become, persecution goes out. And of course, it's been helped by these scandals, which have genuinely scandalized the laity. But I feel a connection with it too, still, a tribal connection.
Did you leave God behind along with the church and the seminary?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it is the truth. You know that Francis Thompson poem, The Hound of Heaven? You can leave God behind, but there is a relentless tread. I don't know if it's a phantom tread that comes out of your own subconscious or whether it's the real tread of the real entity. But I've often thought recently that God was always depicted as the great presence in the universe. If he's not there, or it is not there, if that transcendent thing is not there, then it's the great absence. And the great absence is nearly as transcendent as the great presence. So I once thought of writing a book of prayers to the great absence. So you can see, you can kind of leave the church, but it doesn't fully leave you. And I had a fascinating conversation with that other ex-seminarian, Diarmaid MacCulloch, who writes brilliantly about Christianity. You know, if you're a ruined Christian, an agnostic Christian raised, but you still have that interest in theology and church history, he writes fascinatingly. And what he writes, one of the things that comes out of his latest book is that things we thought of as rigid and immutable laws when we were kids were actually made up along the way, often for political convenience of powerful men. And they were the axes by which we lived or died spiritually. And it's such a shock to find out that, for example, before 1903, you didn't have to go to confession until you were 14. And 1903, they said, oh, you have 7-year-olds, bring them in. And I had a hell of a time thinking of crime. So fortunately, I had a boy with muscular dystrophy next door, and he was the only 8-year-old I could manage to beat up. And so I had that to confess. And this priest said to me in my first confession, oh, boys fight a lot. And I wasn't going to have the sin diminished. I said, yes, but he's a cripple.
Did he allow you that then?
Yeah, I think he put a couple of Hail Marys on my... But, I mean, all around the confessional lies the threat of hell. It's not a very healthy thing for a 7-year-old. I think that's why there are so many Irish Catholic alcoholics and neurotics around, but also great people. I mean, they are great people. They are talkative, eloquent, and storytellers, so many of them from that tradition.
You've described your, I think, father in the past as a great storyteller, and one of the kind of beginnings for your own storytelling was hearing him.
He was a big man for oral history. And if my mother was, God bless her, she died, they both died in their 90s. And my father died at 92, but he would have lived to be a very crazy 105-year-old. But because of the war, it was considered at 92 that the war had shortened his life, and it had. And my mother, therefore, became a war widow, died at 94. And she only died at 94 because she insisted on living on her own. She had a fall. She had her alarm button, but she kept it in its nice box in case she ever needed it. She was a great storyteller in a different way, in that if she was talking, we come from this valley I write about in one of my favorite novels, which is the one before last, The Daughters of Mars. It's about these two aloof Methodist dairy farmers' daughters from the Macleay Valley in New South Wales who become World War I nurses. And where were we going again? Just nudge that.
We were talking about storytelling.
That's the valley my parents came from. And if my mother was talking about someone's hernia operation, she'd begin with the Macleay Valley floods of 1889 and work up. And my father was a defter. He would have made a screenwriter, and she was a novelist.
You've given yourself the ultimate story with your 3 volumes so far, History of Australia, You're on to volume 3 later this year, I think.
Yes, it's coming out later this year. Well, that's the great thing about Australia and New Zealand. We don't have captains and kings. We have characters. We have economic refugees. We have refugees for love. We have, and in Australia, we have the convicts who are a great study. But the social history of the Antipodes is phenomenal, in part because we were at such a remove, and coming to us was like entering a new state of being. It was like going to a new planet in the 19th century and the early 20th century, and this makes our history so rich. The fact that Dickens sent his 2 unsatisfactory sons to Australia, the fact that we're a kind of netherworld. I don't know if that was true of New Zealand, but in The Importance of Being Earnest, Jack says to Algernon, "Your uncle said last night at dinner that you must choose between this world, the next world, and Australia." There is that idea that the Antipodes were a different state of being.
And how about in this period? Because I think it's 1920 to 1967, is that right? Is that the period of the latest volume?
Yes.
And part of that is your lifetime, or part of your lifetime.
Yes, indeed.
You know, how has Australia evolved over your lifetime? What do you see?
The biggest evolution is that from white Australia, a passionately white Australia, to the extent that for Alice, the young woman in Shame and the Captives, for her, an Italian is an exotic and somehow suspect, both an object of fear and curiosity. The death of white Australia has been the most, the biggest thing that's happened in my lifetime. And another thing that New Zealanders would sympathise with is the small representative democracies like New Zealand and Norway and Sweden and Denmark and Holland and New Zealand and Australia, we've always operated under a social contract of government guarantees of equity, mixed economy, where there are guarantees in Australia, for example, of good public education, good public health, and good communications, and everyone agrees with that. And yet we're subject now to an economics which nudges politicians towards not believing in these things anymore. We don't have anything like the Tea Party, thank God. We're lucky to have a consensus on this issue, but we've seen the end. Our Constitution calls us a Commonwealth. The idea that there's a place at the table for everyone is still within the Australian ethos. But it's under threat from this economics that thinks that business should be maximised, and this is the answer to free market economics. We old sentimentalists are told by economists now that Keynes is impossible. You know, the old Keynesian models are not viable anymore. Therefore, you see the beginning of the end of Commonwealth. What began in 1901 as a compact even between progressive conservatives that the punters will be looked after, because we're all in this together, and if you don't look after the punters, it's a threat to society.
It's hard to know what to make of the fact that Tony Abbott studied, I believe, at the same seminary as you did.
Yes, he did. He's a little bit more towards the Opus Dei end of the spectrum.
And to add to the mix, even more kind of bizarrely, what to make of this third factor, Jay Gatsby's mansion in Baz Luhrmann's film that was where they filmed that. So you
yes,
get all
indeed.
It's a
well, the greatest irony is
that
Judy and I live in the grounds of the old seminary, but it's become, all its ghosts have been exorcised. The church and Lend-Lease built some apartments in this beautiful estate on the headland at Manly. And it's the college itself, for lack of vocations, has now become an international school of management. And it has many foreign students from Asia, and Norwegian students do a course in philosophy between high school and university. It's full of Norwegian kids doing philosophy. And a liberal priest friend of mine said, how can you live with the ghosts of all those terrible ayatollahs who emotionally dominated us, you know? And I said, they're not there. You know, when you go for an early morning walk and you see a German girl get out of a cab, adjusting her college uniform and putting on mascara after an all-night session, it sort of does do away with the old Jansenist horrors of the past.
And you didn't, I mean, you don't strike me as a sort of man who would go to a therapist once a week, but, you know, what would he make of the fact that, you know, you chose to live within spitting distance of the seminary?
He'd make a great ambiguity out of it. Yes.
Early in your career, I mean, relatively early in your career, I don't know how you measure success, but you won the Miles Franklin Award in 2 successive years, which I don't think had ever been done before, had it, one year after the other.
This gave me ideas
I was going
above
to say,
my station.
because you've been shortlisted, but not won since. That must
That's
have,
right.
You must have, when you won those 2, think, I'm set up here.
Well, one of the, there are 2 factors in Australian prizes that affect Australian prizes now. There weren't as many novels then. Now there are brilliant novelists. You know, you can't move for tripping over them. And there's this young woman I was at the Adelaide Festival with who's written this book about a woman being hanged in Iceland. Hannah Kent, I think her name is. And she looks as if she's on work experience from year 10, you know. And the quality of writing, I'm sure it's happened here. One of the tragedies, because the way publishing worked under the Empire, and it's not the fault of the Brits, I'm not glad, but our book markets were at the end of the tentacles of the animal. The animal's head was in London, and so you have, say, Random House New Zealand and Random House Australia, and we don't share each other's books. So unless a New Zealander gets shortlisted or an Indian gets shortlisted for the Booker Prize, we don't read each other's books. It's a great tragedy, I think, and I believe there should be festivals devoted purely to Australian and New Zealand books, trans-Tasman festivals.
Because ironically, there is this year in London going to be a festival of Australian and New Zealand for the British. But
yes.
Of course,
yes.
Nonetheless, those writers will go back to their countries, and the readers from those 2 countries will cease to read across the Tasman.
It's a pity there's not a lot of cross traffic between the tentacles.
We've just had, of course, our own I mentioned you hadn't won the Miles Franklin again, but you did win, of course, the Booker. We've just had our own Booker winner. What does winning the Booker do for a writer? And also, I'm interested to a writer. I mean, is there anything that it does to a writer which maybe for the better or worse?
Oh, I think it's wonderful. Peter Carey, my fellow countryman who won it twice and who was a great novelist, he said it's like being hit by a bus. I'm sure to a shy man like him it was a bit, but he wanted, deep down he wanted to be hit by it. And it's a pretty velvet bus. The disadvantage of the Booker is that it takes all the oxygen from all other books in the last quarter of the year in the UK. And that's a slight disadvantage. But it is a wonderful experience and not to be sniffed at all. Because the mention of the word Booker on a book cover means that people are more likely to taste of your wares. So I've got nothing but positive. Of course, the Booker has grown. It was pretty big in 1982, but it's now, of course, begun to include Americans. So it's become a universal English language prize, as it should have. If you win it, then the attitude towards to be taken is that, of course, your work was of such superlative quality that even that jury couldn't overlook it. And if you lose it, you say, well, a jury of that quality is ill-equipped to deal with a groundbreaking book like mine.
You mentioned having the Booker Prize being great on your book jacket. Before I hand the questions over to the audience briefly, I've got a very frivolous question. Why did you stop being Thomas Keneally on your books and Tom Keneally?
Yes, this was a bad idea, but Random House in Sydney said, everyone knows you as Tom, so why don't from now on we put Tom Keneally? The histories, which are published by a different publisher, have Thomas, and my English publisher has Thomas, and so it's created great bibliographical problems, and it was probably a bad idea.
And I believe, when you were growing up, Mick, is that right?
Yes.
Just to confuse matters further.
My mother raised me as Michael, and the kids around me called me Mick. And the whole family still calls me Michael. My real name's Thomas Michael, so I grabbed the Thomas when I started writing as sort of protective covering, like Nikki Gemmell grabbing Anonymous when she wrote that erotic novel, The Bride Stripped Bare. But having covered herself with the name Anonymous, she couldn't help but boast of having written it. And I was a bit the same. No sooner had I covered myself with Thomas, they say, in all the cop shows, the serial killers want to be recognized by the cops. And writers are like that, even if they use the word anonymous.
Well, if anybody in the audience would like to have a word with this serial killer, we've got time for a few questions, I think. There should be some mic runners out here who will come along to you if you put your hand up, and if you could just wait for them to arrive before asking anything. Or I have one down here at the front, just to make you do lots of running. Oh, thank you.
Oh, thank you. Just a few of us leagueies have come along here tonight for a bit of moral guidance. And
What wonderful people. I can see it by the gleam of intelligence in your eye that you're a leaguey, you know.
you might know that we get every Australian league program, and of course we get infatuated with it all. And obviously, amongst some of us, Reg Reagan, Matty Johns is our favourite by far on a Monday night. And of course, you talk about incidents in New Zealand and absolution and things like that. Well, we also relate to the great Racecourse Hotel incident in Christchurch a few years ago with the Cronulla team. So how do you think we should view Matty Johns? Is he absolved from all those?
Oh,
that era?
he's definitely absolved. We were in the same movie together, made by an old Manly player who went out and started to write. His name's Matty Nable, Nable, and he began to write about how hard it is to be a tough guy, which is a problem most of us have never had. But he came from a family where the father was conditioner to the Australian cricket team and to the Australian Kangaroos and to Manly Warringah Rugby League team. And all the boys boxed and all the boys played first grade for Manly. And yet they had all sorts of doubts about themselves. And he wrote some brilliant fiction on that question about a tough guy who's gay and who's known it since the 60s. And he wrote a screenplay called The Final Winter, which is about the last season of a rugby league player. And Matty Johns was a very good actor in that, a natural actor. And I had a role as a gatekeeper. And was about an old player being rubbed out by the corporate interest in the game as an undesirable. I have a role as a gatekeeper saying, players entrance, ladies and gentlemen, hello love, etc. And then the central character arrives in front of me and I have this wonderful line that says, "Oh, Grub, mate, are we ever going to bloody miss you round here?" So as a fellow thespian, all is forgiven for Matty Johns. And Matty Nable's worth reading, and he's an actor too. He has made a career for himself in acting in America and Australia, and he's in the Underbelly series too. I don't know if you get those here.
You do.
So it just shows you what Renaissance men and women rugby league supporters are.
Do we have another question out there, please? Oh, we do. Somebody.
While they're getting there, it's worth saying that the greatest act of cultural recklessness was the Schindler book. You know, I mean, that was weird that I wrote that. I think it's weird now.
And did you even think at the time that you were biting off something pretty big?
Yes, I did fear it. And then later I remembered that European connection and that connection with the Third Reich through my father. And the fact that I was a hick from Australia and yet my metropolitan betters had let ethnic hysteria run to such an extreme limit. But anyhow,
so I think we have a microphone there now.
Sir, your really entertaining talk has inspired us, and your books too reflect, make us reflect on having a social conscience, which you obviously have. And we were just considering that it seems that those sorts of towering figures of strong social conscience in the public arena don't seem to be around quite so much in this century as perhaps in the past. Do you have any idea why that might be?
Let me say for a start that writers are troublemakers, not because they're moral giants, but because they're fascinated in people who are on the margins. If you say, there are two kinds of children. When their mother says that they never should play with the gypsies in the wood, there's a kind of kid who says, oh no, I'll never play with them because they're so weird. And there's another sort of kid that says, I want to play with them because if my mother's against them, they must be interesting. And writers tend to fall into that perverse secondary thing. So it's not that it's not because we're moral giants in any way. You can ask Judy, my wife, who's here, who knows I'm not a moral giant. It's purely that we're so used to imagining the other person that we become engaged, as a great New Zealand novelist who lives in Australia, Rosie Scott. She and I have collected a book on asylum seekers written by some really first-class fiction writers, writing on that subject, purely in an attempt to put a human face on the asylum seeker, more and more of whom we're going to be meeting, because there are nearly 50 million displaced people on Earth. So we're going to be meeting a lot of those people, even down here in New Zealand. And I was delighted that Australian writers wanted to write on this issue. Very sensible essays and fiction, not polemics, just putting a human face on the problem. I think writers are still pretty good at swinging into place, but they don't get noticed as much. You know,
I was going to say,
there's no Victor
do people
Hugo,
listen?
there's no Jacques. That was Victor Hugo, wasn't it? Jacques, or the other Blake. Anyhow.
Yeah, Zola.
You know, there are all sorts of good people out there in the community writing about social justice, but it doesn't reverberate as, I don't think it reverberates quite as much as it used to. In Australia, we've got also a heavy dominance by one press organisation, and we've got, and maybe this influences us, but there are some pretty game people out there, but it's hard to get your voice heard, even if you're a troublemaker. And our governments, thank God, the New Zealand government and the Australian government, have such a low regard for writers, they never imprison any of us. And I hope it stays that way. I often wonder how outspoken I'd be if I was in a regime that does imprison writers. And the writers' organisation, PEN, of course, is heavily involved in that issue of prison writers. So I think there are a lot of noble people arguing social justice issues, but they don't get heard like in the old days.
I'm awfully sorry, I don't think we have time for more questions. I'm just going to quickly, though, grab one very quick last one, because Tom once asked Kerry Hume how she'd like to be known, whether she'd like to be known as a novelist and white baiter, and she said she'd like to be known as a white baiter and novelist. And I just wondered, how would you like to be known, Tom?
Well, interestingly, you know, when you're young, you're very narcissistic, and you think the world needs your book, you know. 2 years before you were a deadbeat in Homebush, New South Wales, suddenly you're the bloke whose book the world needs, you know. Terrible narcissism and arrogance goes into writing a book, as well as a terrible vulnerability. And so at the time I met Kerry Hume in the 90s here during your sesquicentenary over in beautiful Hokitika, I would have thought I wanted to be known as a novelist primarily. But that weird thing happened where you get grandchildren. And that strange, you think you've seen enough snot and poo to last you a lifetime. You never want to encounter it again. And yet there's a strange infatuation hits with grandparenthood. And I've made a bit of a second career out of being a grandparent. And I try to go on all the roller coasters and so on. I'm trying not to be the sort of person who says, I can't do that. I can't, but I still do it. I really messed up my skeletal frame by going on one of these, 3 of these long water tubes that my daughter, a few weeks ago, which are great for 8-year-olds, but and I think I'd like to be known as grandparent and novelist. I mean, it's become more.
Yeah.
And that's not because I'm noble, that's because I'm selfish. I need those little people for therapy.
Don't we all? So 50 books, 6 kilometres a day, and a good grandparent. I can't think of anything better. Thanks very much to Tom Keneally, and thank you for you for coming this evening. If you could just let Tom leave the stage and go to the signing table, he'll be there then for you to take your books to be signed by him. Thanks very much for coming this evening.